everyone, or afternoon, wherever you're listening from. Welcome back to the Ideal Nutrition Podcast. Today we are talking about whether there is a sweet spot for dietary fat intake in athletes specifically. Where to start? So fat is one that you probably hear a lot less talk about for athletes when compared to other macronutrients like protein and carbohydrates. But that doesn't mean that it's not important.
Where do we want to start? Do we want to start with why people need it or what we recommend?
Let's chat about why people need it or the importance of adequate intake.
Yeah, cool. So this is relevant for both men and women in different ways. I would say it's particularly relevant from a hormonal perspective in terms of why we need it, in terms of trying to avoid going too low. So going too low fat can reduce estrogen and progesterone in women. It also has implications for testosterone in women as well. Women tend to be more likely to lose their cycle if fat intake is too low. Note that it always has the potential to be skewed by, well, if fat intake is too low, is their total calorie intake too low, which often makes it hard to interpret stuff like this without going on too much of a tangent. The same thing happens in intermittent fasting research, where a lot of people put a big emphasis on eating breakfast, but you're like, if they eat breakfast, are they also eating more calories? Is that a factor? Pretty deep rabbit hole. Men, simpler creatures. If you go too low fat, it can reduce testosterone. I might give numbers around that later, but yeah, you can reduce testosterone. And we're talking about athletes here, so I don't think many athletes would specifically want low testosterone.
Other things that it's essential for is the absorption of fat-soluble vitamins, which are necessary for things like immune function, bone health, antioxidant defense. So I'm specifically talking about A, D, E, and K there. Generally, fats are important for cell membrane health, organs, also managing appetite and supporting satiety as well.
I've looked into it's hard to get clear answers on this, but like how much fat do we require for fat-soluble vitamins and stuff like that? It definitely does seem more linked to like total intake than it does to like timing it together, although that can also be a relevant part of this. The reason why I've looked into this is through the lens of, I've got a rule, I don't talk about this on podcast stuff often, but like if somebody's taking performance enhancing drugs, say a male's taking testosterone, that takes away what I just spoke about, where it's like, well, if they don't need this for testosterone, what is left? And it's what you've just mentioned. And it seems like we don't need much to kind of tick that box for fat-soluble vitamins. I don't really want to put a cutoff here, because it also scales based on amounts a little bit, where like if I was to say like, oh, you need like 25 grams of fat or like some like low number, if you then also went and checked and be like, do we absorb any more at 50 versus 25 grams as an example, you'd probably see a bit better absorption at 50. But it does seem like it only takes quite a small amount to like tick that box enough to absorb nutrients well enough if we've got a high intake of nutrients.
There's definitely downsides of going too low, which we've just spoken about. What about the downsides of going too high, specifically in this population?
Two things. One is that the simple one, you could go over your calories. Let's make the assumption that you're going to hit an appropriate calorie intake regardless. And we're just talking about having too high a percentage of calories coming from that, or too much of those calories coming from fat. The downside is largely that it takes away from the opportunity to get in other macronutrients, because the first one is like, let's say it takes away from the opportunity to get in protein. Obviously, that's going to have a detrimental impact on things like muscle growth and also just recovery in general. The other one is it takes away from the opportunity to get enough carbs in. And we know that glycogen can have benefits for athletes as well. We might talk about like low carb and stuff like that later on as well, but keeping it simple, glycogen and carbs can have benefits for athletes.
And I wanted to add on to that one as well, because I had those exact same things written down. Also, just talking about blood lipid profiles and generally healthy eating for anyone going too high in fat can have unwanted effects on the proportions of your blood lipid profiles, specifically if they are those more saturated fats. Should we chat about the sweet spot then and where our recommendations actually lie?
I reckon I want you to go first on this one.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk about percentages, and Aidan and I have spoken off air that percentages don't always show the full picture. But if we're looking generally, 20 to 35% of total calories coming from fat is a pretty good range to look at to help with, like we said, energy, hormones, nutrient absorption, and then just making sure that we tick all those boxes. The exact percentage within this range, though, can vary, and we know that athletes have generally high calorie or energy requirements. Very likely they don't need to be getting quite 20 to 35% if we've got an increased intake of carbohydrates, protein, and things like that.
Yeah, and if I go with percentages, that's the range I go with, that 20 to 35%. Where I think it falls apart and why I wouldn't use this across the board is I think it falls apart under different intakes. For example, one athlete they do a bulking phase. They're in a calorie surplus. They're on quite high calories. Then they do a deficit phase. They're on lower calories. If they just use the same percentage, theoretically, they could end up dropping too low fat and or having more fat than they require, so to speak. That can get more skewed if it's a bigger deficit as well. For example, for a bigger deficit, I'm going to keep people on high protein. I'm going to keep them ideally enough fat for hormones and stuff like that, particularly if it's like longer and most of it's going to end up coming from carbs. That's a trade-off where it's like there's downsides of that, but that's one I'm more willing to make. What I will then use as a bit of a range, which equally has flaws as well, is I say 0.5 to 1 gram per kilo, where I don't really see much need to go up to 1 gram per kilo in many cases. That's more just if somebody happened to have a bit of a preference. And also, if it made it logistically easier for them to reach their calorie target if they're on quite high. Because above a certain threshold, I don't think we get noticeably more benefits from adding more fat. For example, if somebody, like we do see testosterone increase a tiny bit above a certain point, but it just doesn't seem to meaningfully move the needle on actual like performance outcomes and stuff like that. I just don't seem to need to go higher than that, but that's my own thoughts. The bottom end of that range is a bit of an arbitrary cutoff as well, where I think that in many cases that is not so low that people are going to run into issues. One thing we did speak about off air is one time I did put this number out there and somebody very validly made a comment along the lines of, hey, I'm a 50 to 60 kilo woman. The bottom end of that range seems quite low for me. And I'm like, that is very valid as well. I absolutely would not go that low. Like if somebody was, let's say, 60 kilos, I wouldn't give them 30 grams of fat. I would go higher. But it's very hard for me to put a cutoff out there and give specific numbers without it having flaws like that. So that's my kind of logic there.
And it also, like you said before, really feeds into what their goal is at that point in time. Do we want to increase other areas of diet so that fat is a little bit lower? Is there a little bit more calories to play with? Can we push it up to that higher range? All those sorts of things. Is this something that obviously we calculate things when we do meal plans and we talk clients through things. Would you recommend people out there who are listening to do this calculation or have a look at fat themselves?
Depends how much you care.
Yeah, I agree.
My kind of process would be, if you do care about this, first thing I do is like get a rough range of what your calorie target is. Like you could use a calculator. You could also just do something for a bit and see what happens. And then your protein, like I'm often going to recommend 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilo. And then your fats, I would give that range of 0.5 to 1 gram per kilo and fill out the rest with carbs. If something weird started happening with carbs, it's probably more likely when I'm going to like move you up or down that kind of spectrum. For example, if carbs are getting really, really low, I might consider moving the fat closer towards the bottom of the spectrum to give you more carbs. If carbs are getting really, really high, I'd be like, maybe it's just like logistically a lot easier to get this intake if we just move the fat up slightly. Cool. Is there anything else? The low carb stuff, we'll circle back to that. If we're looking at athletes, like there's just not much research showing that low carb outperforms. Like it's pretty simple, but like every time in research, not every single time, but very close, every time they're tested, low carb is not outperforming. That doesn't mean it's always like underperforming noticeably. There are many times where it would be okay to do, particularly in like say the ultra endurance space. It seems like to be more common to like not underperform. The lower intensity something is, the less likely it is to noticeably underperform. But if somebody went down that route of wanting to be low carb, you'd obviously have to change the numbers I just said, where it's like maybe you go up to like 1.5 or 2 grams per kilo body weight fat. It's also very calorie dense, which means often the numbers don't have to go super, super high. But I'm looking at this mostly under the perspective of people not going low carb, just because I just don't see that outperforming.
I agree. I think time and time again, and we get this question fairly often, we recommend carbs, ideally. Keep carbs in your diet, guys. It's the best thing you can do. Amazing.
Cool. Well, we will wrap it up there. This has been episode 236 of the Ideal Nutrition Podcast. As always, if you haven't already, please leave a rating and review. We massively appreciate it.